Suddenly, that long train makes the state landau look remarkably full.
Shockwaves ripple through the palace as Queen Camilla crosses an unthinkable line. A cherished relic that should have been protected for generations was brutally violated, leaving Catherine to question the very family she married into. But what could have driven Camilla to commit such an unthinkable act? And how can Catherine possibly recover a piece of history that has been torn to pieces? Join us as we reveal the shocking scene inside the palace vault, and why Princess Catherine was left utterly heartbroken. The fairy tale. On the morning of July 29, 1981, the streets of London were alive with excitement. Millions of people waited outside. Some had camped overnight just to see a young woman become a princess. The sound of church bells mixed with the voices of the crowd, while television cameras were set up everywhere, ready to share this moment with the 700 million people tuned in that morning to watch a girl become a princess. They held their breath as the carriage rolled in front of the cathedral and watched as the doors opened. But nothing prepared everyone for what their eyes saw next. It was the wedding gown. Diana's wedding gown was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Made with ivory silk taffeta, the gown dazzled in the summer sunlight. The puffed sleeves elevated her shoulders, and the tiny pearls around the neckline seemed to catch the light with every step she took. And then there was the 25-foot-long train that flowed behind her like a river. It looked like it had come straight out of a fairy tale, and everyone who saw it was genuinely wowed. It was just as the designers, David and Elizabeth Emanuel, wanted. They had been secretly working on the dress for months, ensuring that no single sketch or piece of fabric left their studio. Diana had to look like an actual princess, and the reveal had to be unforgettable. But it wasn't only about fashion. The designers sewed history right into it. Even the most minor details of the gown carried meaning. The lace that decorated it was antique, connecting Diana to royal brides of the past. The fabric came from Britain, chosen to honor tradition and national pride. And hidden inside the dress was a tiny gold horseshoe sewn into the label for good luck. That day, as Diana sauntered up the steps, her head lowered under her veil, the dress seemed to speak for her. But the magic wasn't only in how it looked. It was in how it made her feel. Diana had once admitted she was scared that day, scared of the attention, the eyes, and the weight of what came next. Yet when she put on that dress, something changed. Somehow, the beauty of the dress gave her the confidence she needed to walk down the aisle. By the next morning, Diana had created a global dream. Her image was everywhere. Designers called it perfect, and every bride wanted to copy it. Still, no replica could recreate the first time the world looked at that dress. For many years, people continued to speak of Diana's gown with so much awe, and many anticipated the day she would hand it over to her daughter or her son's bride, until the day tragedy struck. In 1997, a terrible event occurred that changed many lives forever. Princess Diana passed away in a tragic car accident. The world was shattered, and it mourned deeply. But as tributes trooped in from several countries, the palace was left with one of many questions. What would become of her most precious belongings? The fashion relic. Princess Diana wasn't just known for her beauty or her title, she was known for her heart. Hospitals, homeless shelters, and children's wards were her royal palaces. She didn't simply visit, she sat with them, holding hands while she listened. It's why, even years after her passing, her charities still speak her name, like a prayer whispered through time. So, when her belongings were auctioned off, no one was surprised that the proceeds went straight to the causes she loved. Dresses, shoes, even the iconic ones that had graced red carpets, were sold to fund research and relief for people she'd once met and never forgotten.
But we're great. Both of us love classical music, and the opera, and the ballet, and go whenever we can to see it.
But there was one gown the world thought would never be sold, the one that made history, her wedding dress. Still, when rumors spread that it would also be auctioned off, it made sense to the people. After all, if every other piece of Diana's wardrobe had been given away, what greater gift could there be than auctioning the dress? So people waited, some even estimating it could fetch millions. But that day never came. Instead of going to a museum or an auction house, Diana's wedding dress went home. For years, it rested quietly at Althorpe House, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire. Her brother, Earl Spencer, kept it there, carefully preserved, shown only during special exhibitions. Visitors would come and whisper in awe, standing before the glass case that held the dress that changed royal history. In their childhood, William and Harry would occasionally visit Althorpe, and when they did, they'd ask to see the dress. Staff recalled how they'd stare at it quietly, as if trying to imagine how their mother felt that morning she wore it before the world. Then, in 2014, everything changed. According to Diana's will, all her personal items were to be passed to her sons once both had turned 30. And that year, they finally did. The dress was handed to Prince William and Prince Harry. For a while, many believed it was moved to Kensington Palace, where Diana once lived. However, those close to the family knew that it had been placed in a secure vault, designed to maintain the ideal atmosphere for preserving the dress. Years later, the gown made rare appearances, such as in 2021, when it was displayed at Kensington Palace as part of an exhibition called Royal Style in the Making. It was the first time in 25 years the world had seen it again, and for many, it felt like seeing Diana herself forever walking down that aisle. Yet, through all those years and changes, one thing remained constant. None of her daughters-in-law ever wore it. Not Kate, not Meghan. It was as if the gown no longer belonged to the monarchy. It belonged to her story. And perhaps that's fitting, because the story of that dress was never really about a wedding. It was about a woman stepping into a world that never truly understood her. Decades later, when Charles remarried, it was a completely different story, quiet and modest, as though the echo of Diana's cathedral vows still lingered in the air. But how did Camilla finally become the queen? And why did Diana's memory follow her into every room she entered? The princess's shadow. Camilla had been in Charles's life long before Diana ever appeared, but for years her name existed in the shadows, spoken only in gossip columns and hushed palace corridors. However, nothing stays secret forever, and soon the truth about Charles's affair with Camilla was in public. It broke Diana, who later recounted that it felt like there were 3 of them in the marriage. After Diana's death, Charles and Camilla began appearing together more frequently, first at private events, then in public, and eventually in royal gatherings. But every outing came with reminders that Diana had done it first, and how she had done it differently. When their wedding was finally announced in 2005, the world watched closely. It wasn't held in a cathedral.
They'd actually take the time out to come and talk to us. It's just unbelievable.
No crowds were lining the streets or a 25-foot train trailing behind her. Instead, it was a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a small blessing at St. George's Chapel. And if Diana's wedding had felt like a fairy tale, Camilla's felt like a correction, as though the crown was trying to move forward without drawing too much attention to the past. Camilla didn't wear ivory silk or lace. She wore a pale blue coat and a golden feathered hat. Elegant, yes, but modest. Even her ring wasn't new. It was the same one Charles's grandmother, the Queen Mother, had once worn. Every part of the ceremony seemed to whisper one thing: this is not a replacement. And even if they had tried to replace her, the world was not ready to accept it. For many years, Camilla attended to her royal duties with grace. But the people couldn't stop making comparisons. And somehow, they never forgot the wedding. Even when Charles became king, the whispers didn't cease. And maybe that's why, when the gown was finally returned to royal care, the story took a turn that few outside the palace ever knew. According to close insiders, there came a day when Camilla requested to see the dress that had once filled a cathedral with light. By then, the gown was no longer at Althorpe. It had been transferred under the ownership of William and Harry. It wasn't displayed. It wasn't spoken of, and it simply rested, sealed in layers of preservation, away from time itself. Camilla's visit wasn't part of a ceremony or official duty. It was discreet, so only a handful of people even knew she was there. But even as she stood silently before the vault, no one around her knew what thoughts flooded her mind that day. Perhaps she remembered how the world had compared Diana and her. Or maybe she just envied how one single gown could still hold the world captive decades later. Soon she seemed to have arrived at a decision. Slowly, she opened the latches, revealing the beautiful ivory silk gown. From the shelf beside her, she opened the kit to reveal small brushes, cotton pads, a bone folder, and scissors with narrow blades that shone faintly in her hand. She weighed them a moment, then lowered them toward the fabric. But would Camilla really destroy something so sacred? The night of the scissors. The vault was never supposed to open that night. There was no public schedule or palace event. But when the queen makes a request, who says no? Camilla stood there alone, carrying a kit, the light dim, her breath faint against the glass. The preservation team had long since left, and the hum of the air control was the only sound. Maybe she thought that if she looked at the gown, really looked, she could finally free herself from it. Camilla held up the sharp scissors and took a deep breath. Then a soft sound echoed in the vault. It was a tiny snip. Camilla had cut Diana's wedding dress. Another cut followed, then another. The delicate threads that once held the seams of a royal dream began to loosen. The pearls were scattered like tiny tears across the table, silk folded and slumped in her hands, no longer glowing or sacred. For the first time in decades, Diana's dress breathed again, but only to die. Weeks passed before anyone noticed, and the morning it all changed began like any other inside the palace. The rain had just stopped, so the air must have felt cool. Catherine was in her private rooms reviewing papers when an aide entered with trembling hands. He bowed slightly, but his voice shook as he struggled to find the words. Finally, he whispered that something terrible had happened, that Camilla had touched what should never be touched. The sacred dress of Diana had been cut apart. For a moment, Catherine remained still. It was just as if he had spoken unreal words. She stared at him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Then, without another thought, she pushed back her chair and hurried out of the room. Her footsteps echoed down the long corridor. She moved faster, almost running. Staff turned their heads as she passed, their faces full of worry, but no one dared to stop her. The palace clock ticked overhead, marking each step she took toward the vault. When she reached the secure wing, the guard at the desk looked alarmed. He tried to speak, but Catherine lifted her hand and went straight past him. The heavy door opened, and she stepped into the cold corridor. As soon as she pushed open the vault door, her eyes fell on the table, and her heart stopped for a second. The gown was gone. Not gone completely, but destroyed. The ivory silk was torn into strips. The long train, once folded neatly, had been cut apart like ribbons.
No, well, Louis knew about the dances. I was just going to show.
Pearls were scattered across the floor, rolling into corners like tiny fallen stars. Catherine gasped and stumbled forward, her knees bent as she reached the table, her hand flying to her mouth. The sight was too much. The dress that had once belonged to Diana, the one that also belonged to William and Harry, was ruined. She touched the fabric with trembling fingers. The silk was soft but lifeless. She lifted a strip and held it to her chest as if by holding it she could protect what was left. But nothing could undo what had been done. Catherine tried to ask questions, but her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. There weren't many questions to ask. The aide had been clear about who did this. It was none other than the queen consort. To Catherine, who valued duty so much, the dress was her responsibility. She never got to meet her mother-in-law, but she knew how much her husband and his brother cherished the dress. Seeing it in such a state, and knowing she would have to bear the news to William, broke her. And so, the tears began to fall. The pain she felt was deep, but beneath it, something more substantial had begun to rise. She stood slowly, still holding a strip of silk in her hand. Her steps were unsteady at first, but her back was straight. She turned towards the door, her eyes burning with determination through her grief. But when the truth surfaced, how would William react to the unthinkable? The confrontation. By the time Catherine left the vault, the tears had stopped. but her eyes remained red with fury. She moved with purpose, her heart pounding, her mind fixed on the truth she could no longer unsee. Somewhere deep inside the palace, Camilla was seated in calm comfort, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the devastation left behind. Catherine entered the room without warning, and the moment their eyes met, tension filled the air immediately. It was not just a confrontation between two women, but between two legacies, one born from pain and one built on survival. Camilla remained expressionless, as if she had no idea what Camilla had come for. The silence between them carried years of unspoken resentment and grief. Catherine's presence was like a storm that had finally broken its restraint. The piece of silk she carried trembled in her hand, and on the table beside them, the torn fabric spread like an open wound. The meaning was impossible to miss. Something precious had been destroyed not out of necessity, but out of jealousy, and the desire to escape a shadow that refused to fade. The confrontation didn't need words to wound. The silence itself was louder than any shouting could be. Two women, bound by the same crown, stood on opposite sides of history, one haunted by a past she could never escape, the other grieving a legacy she could never protect. In that moment, the palace felt smaller.
Having been lucky enough to meet some of our country's amazing charities and organizations,
its grandeur dimmed by the weight of what had been done. When Catherine finally turned away, her grief had hardened into resolve. She left the room without a glance back, with a clear purpose. Back in the private quarters, William was waiting. As soon as he saw the look on Catherine's face, he could tell that something had happened. Without speaking, Catherine opened her hand, and in her palm rested 3 small pearls, tiny fragments of the past, now heavy with meaning. Together, they walked to the vault. The guards at the door stepped aside without question, sensing the gravity in their silence. When the door opened, the air inside was cold and heavy, with the scent of preservation. Before them lay the remains of Diana's gown. William didn't move for a long time. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the storm. He stepped forward and let his fingers brush against the torn edge of the gown. His jaw tightened. No words came, but the silence around him was thick with unspoken rage. He bent slightly and picked up one of the scattered pearls. For a moment, he held it close as if it were a heartbeat, before placing it gently beside the others. With every gesture, the weight of how he felt trembled beneath the surface. Catherine stood beside him, still holding the small golden horseshoe. The light reflected off it faintly, and around them, the vault felt like a tomb. Every thread on the table seemed to carry whispers of that day in 1981, but now all of it was gone, desecrated by hands that should have protected it. William straightened slowly and began giving precise orders. Every remaining piece of silk, every scattered pearl, was to be gathered with care. Nothing was to be repaired or altered. The dress, in its destroyed state, would be sealed and preserved exactly as it was, and the vault was to be locked forever. When it was done, he turned to Catherine with an unshaken resolve. He placed one pearl in her hand and another in his pocket. As for the last third, he set it on the window ledge of the vault as if to remember what had been lost. As they left the vault, Catherine still held the gold horseshoe close to her chest. William paused at the door and looked back one final time. The light from the corridor framed his silhouette, casting long shadows across the broken silk remains. What lay behind him was no longer just a ruined dress. It was a personal and unforgettable wound. And though no one outside that vault would ever know what had happened that night, for William, everything had changed. Late one evening, the two sat together in their private room. Between them lay the small gold horseshoe Catherine had taken from the ruined gown. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a fragment of luck from a shattered dream. They spoke little, as there was nothing left to say that could bring the dress back. Yet in that silence, a new understanding formed. They could not preserve the past, but they could protect its spirit. That night, they made a vow to keep Diana's legacy alive, not through things that could burn or be stolen, but through living deeds that could never be destroyed. From that moment, Catherine's work deepened. She visited hospitals and children's wards with a gentleness that mirrored Diana's own warmth. She listened, comforted, and stayed longer than her schedule allowed. Every smile she offered carried the echo of Diana's compassion. William, too, found new meaning in his duties. Together, they supported mental health charities, met families in need, and spoke openly about vulnerability and loss. Through every act, they rebuilt what the scissors had undone, not in silk, but in humanity. At home, Catherine ensured that Diana's memory lived on in their children's world. She showed them photographs of their grandmother and told stories about the laughter and kindness that once filled her days. The children learned to see Diana not as a figure of history but as part of their family, someone whose spirit still guided them quietly from beyond. They laid flowers and shared stories. George asked about her charity work, Charlotte about her smile, and little Louis about her crown. Catherine answered every question with tenderness. The memory of Diana became more than history. It became a living presence woven through their daily lives. But William's anger was only the beginning, because when Harry found out, the grief cut even deeper. How do you face losing your mother all over again? The brothers' grief. When the message reached Harry, it was delivered almost fearfully, yet the message had to be delivered, and so it landed with devastating force. Diana's wedding gown, the one he and William had guarded as their mother's most sacred relic, was gone. He sat still for a long time, staring at the floor. No words came, only the hollow rise and fall of his chest. Memories flooded in. Walking behind his mother's coffin at 12, the cameras flashing like lightning, the echo of his footsteps beside William's. Through all those years, knowing that a piece of his mother was left behind in a safe and untouchable state gave him so much comfort. Now, even that was destroyed. When he learned what had happened, his body tensed with disbelief. For Harry, it wasn't only anger, it was betrayal. The palace that had promised to guard his mother's memory had failed once more. He thought of the little box that had protected the gown for decades, the same one he'd once touched as a boy. To him, its destruction wasn't just about fabric, it was about losing her all over again. That night, he sat alone with a framed photo of Diana taken on her wedding day. Her radiant and hopeful smile seemed to shimmer beneath the glass. He whispered an apology to her, to William, and to himself for not being there, and for not protecting what mattered. He and William had been at loggerheads for a few years now, and Harry had left the palace. Perhaps he felt that if he had been there in the palace, he would have been able to stop it from ever happening. The wedding gown had once been more than silk and lace. It had been a symbol of purity and promise, of youth and impossible dreams. To the world, it was the embodiment of a fairy tale. To her sons, it was proof that their mother had once been happy, even if only for a moment. Now that symbol is gone. The destruction of the dress was more than the loss of an heirloom. It was the collapse of a shared memory. For William and Harry, it had been the last tangible bridge between them, something they both loved equally, something that belonged to neither the crown nor the press, but to their mother alone. Now, with it gone, the distance between them seemed wider and almost irreversible. Inside the palace, the mood turned somber. The fragments of the gown were preserved under strict order, but nothing could mend what had been done. Every thread was stored and sealed away. Yet the air itself felt changed and haunted by what was missing. Even those who had never met Diana sensed that something irreplaceable had been lost. To the few who knew the truth, it felt as if time had folded back on itself. The same grief that once silenced London's bells now echoed quietly behind closed doors. Diana's story had always carried light and tragedy in equal measure. Her dress had once balanced those two worlds, part dream, part memory. Now, in its ruin, that balance was gone, and in that silence, one truth remained unspoken. The destruction of the gown was not only the loss of a relic, but also the end of a promise between two brothers who had once sworn to protect their mother's legacy together. Do you think Catherine and William were right to turn Diana's memory into something living rather than keeping it locked away in a vault? And if Diana were alive today, do you think she'd be proud of how they've carried her legacy? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.